The story of the ultimate adversary begins not in a fiery underworld, but in the highest echelons of a cosmic court, where a being described as the seal of perfection chose to rebel against his creator. This narrative of Lucifer's fall, his descent to earth, his deception of humanity, and the ultimate promise of his defeat, forms the central dramatic arc of the biblical text. The scope of this conflict stretches from the prophetic poetry of Isaiah and Ezekiel down into the dirt of Eden, through the severe trials of Job, and culminates in the definitive overcoming promise delivered by Jesus in the Gospel of John.
The roots of this cosmic conflict are heavily detailed in passages like Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. These texts are fascinating because they initially address human rulers, the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre. The prophets use these earthly tyrants as a lens to describe a spiritual reality. Ezekiel paints a picture of a being who was in Eden, the garden of God, walking among the fiery stones. He is described as an anointed guardian cherub on the holy mountain of God.
The term cherub often brings to mind Renaissance paintings of chubby babies with wings, but the biblical reality is entirely different. Cherubim were formidable, complex beings associated with guarding the holiness of God, much like the cherubim placed at the entrance of Eden with a flaming sword.
The original Hebrew portrays them as majestic and imposing figures. This specific cherub is described as the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. The tragedy of the narrative is rooted in this beauty. Ezekiel states that his heart became proud on account of his beauty, and he corrupted his wisdom because of his splendor.
Isaiah 14 captures the internal monologue of this rebellion. The text records him saying in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, I will make myself like the Most High." The offense was self-ascendancy. This being coveted the position and glory that belongs solely to the Creator. The title Lucifer actually originates from the Latin Vulgate translation of Isaiah 14:12, where the Hebrew phrase Hillel ben Shahar, meaning shining one, son of the dawn, is translated as Lucifer, the morning star.
The ambition to be like the Most High is the defining characteristic of this rebellion. God's response to this attempted coup is swift and decisive. The text declares, "I cast you to the ground." This expulsion from the heavenly mountain marks the transition of this shining morning star into the adversary, the one who opposes God's order.
That casting down places him directly in the human sphere. Revelation 12 later describes this event retrospectively, stating that the great dragon, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels with him. He doesn't just wander aimlessly, he immediately targets the pinnacle of God's physical creation.
The narrative moves straight into Genesis 3. The adversary takes the form of a serpent. The Hebrew word used to describe the serpent is arum, which translates to crafty, shrewd, or sensible. What stands out here is the methodology. He does not attack Adam and Eve with physical force. He attacks them with a question. Did God really say? It is a masterclass in psychological and spiritual subversion.
He twists the divine command just enough to plant a seed of doubt regarding God's character. God had provided an entire garden of sustenance, restricting only one tree. The serpent reframes this abundant provision as an oppressive restriction. He suggests that God is holding something back, that God is a jealous dictator rather than a loving provider.
That is the core deception. The serpent tells Eve, "You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." He offers them the exact same temptation that caused his own fall. The desire for autonomy, the desire to be like God, determining the parameters of right and wrong for themselves. By eating the fruit, Adam and Eve align themselves with the serpent's original rebellion. This act fractures the relationship between humanity and God, bringing the consequences of sin, decay, and death into the world.
This brings us to a complex part of the biblical narrative, the book of Job. Here, the adversary is explicitly named Satan, a Hebrew word meaning the accuser or satis, and he is described as roaming the earth.
In Job chapter 1, we are given a glimpse into the ancient Near Eastern concept of a divine council. There is a gathering of the heavenly court. God asks Satan where he has come from, and Satan replies, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." This establishes him as an active, observant force within the human realm, constantly searching for vulnerabilities.
God points out Job's blameless character. Satan immediately acts as a prosecuting attorney, launching an accusation against both Job and God. He argues that Job only serves God because God has placed a hedge of protection and blessing around him. More blessing checking.
The adversary's thesis is that human devotion is entirely transactional. He asserts that if the material blessings are removed, the loyalty will vanish. "Stretch out your hand and strike everything he has," Satan challenges, "and he will surely curse you to your face." God permits Satan to test this theory, resulting in the sudden, catastrophic loss of Job's wealth, his children, and eventually his physical health.
The book of Job highlights the destructive capacity of the devil when permitted to act. He orchestrates raids by foreign armies, fire from the sky, a violent windstorm, and painful boils. The suffering is visceral and comprehensive, yet the text maintains a strict boundary. Satan's power is subordinate to God's sovereignty. He can only operate within the exact limits God establishes.
It also clarifies the adversary's primary motive. He isn't trying to conquer physical territory, he is trying to break a human spirit and prove that God is unworthy of unconditional love. The tension in the book of Job revolves around whether humans can love God for who he is rather than what he gives. Job's endurance, despite his deep confusion, grief, and agony, ultimately proves the accuser wrong. Job refuses to curse God, dismantling Satan's argument.
The New Testament crystallizes this destructive nature into a single, sharp contrast. In the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus states, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full."
That verse is a theological linchpin for understanding the spiritual conflict. Jesus uses the pastoral metaphor of a sheepfold. In ancient Judea, a sheepfold was a stone deck to prevent hay to catch door. The shepherd would literally lay his body across the opening at night, becoming the gate himself. Jesus is the good shepherd, and he contrasts himself with thieves and robbers who climb over the wall to exploit the flock. Biblical scholars universally view this thief as a direct reference to the adversary.
The agenda of the devil is summarized in three precise verbs: steal, kill, destroy. He steals peace, he kills physical and spiritual vitality, and he destroys relationships, communities, and purpose. The methodology of the thief mirrors what we see in Eden and in the life of Job. The theft is rarely an overt, aggressive assault. It is often subtle. He steals truth by replacing it with a plausible lie. He destroys trust by sowing suspicion.
Jesus positions himself as the direct antidote to this destruction. "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full," or as many translations render it, abundantly. The abundant life Jesus offers is not a promise of endless material wealth or a life free of hardship, which is a very common misinterpretation in modern consumer culture. The Greek word for life used here is zoe, which refers to the uncreated, eternal, spiritual life of God. Jesus is offering a restoration of the authentic relationship that was lost in Eden. Where the adversary brings spiritual death, isolation, and alienation, Jesus brings spiritual vitality, communion, and reconciliation.
Despite the offer of this abundant life, the biblical text does not ignore the ongoing reality of hardship and spiritual warfare. Later, in the Gospel of John, in chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus is preparing his disciples for his imminent arrest, crucifixion, and their future persecution. He tells them, "I have told you these things, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world."
Jesus is brutally honest about the human condition under the influence of the fallen world. The word translated as trouble or tribulation is thlipsis, which carries the literal meaning of being crushed under pressure or facing severe affliction. Living in a world where the adversary is still active guarantees friction. The early Christians reading this gospel were facing intense persecution from both the Roman Empire and religious authorities. They were experiencing this thlipsis daily.
The command to take heart or be of good cheer is anchored in a completed action. I have overcome the world. The phrasing is significant. He speaks of overcoming the world in the past tense, even before the physical events of the crucifixion and resurrection take place. It speaks to the absolute certainty of the victory. He is assuring them that the system of rebellion, orchestrated by the adversary, is already a defeated power.
By going to the cross, Jesus absorbs the ultimate penalty of sin and the full force of the adversary's malice. The Apostle Paul writes in Colossians 2 that Jesus disarmed the spiritual powers and authorities, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The devil's ultimate weapon, the finality of death, is rendered powerless by the resurrection.
This leads to the most pressing practical application for the believer. If Jesus has already overcome the world, what is the mechanism by which individuals overcome the devil in their daily lives? The biblical text does not advocate for passivity or fear.
The book of Revelation provides a definitive formula for this. Revelation 12:11 states, "They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony." The foundation of the victory is not human willpower, moral perfection, or rigorous self-discipline. The blood of the Lamb refers to the finished work of Jesus on the cross, which removes the guilt of sin. Since Satan operates primarily as the accuser, bringing up past failures and ongoing flaws, the removal of guilt entirely neutralizes his primary weapon. If the debt is paid, the accusation holds no weight in the divine court.
The word of their testimony implies a vocal, lived alignment with that truth. It is the active, daily declaration of allegiance to God's reality over the adversary's lies. James 4:7 offers a very straightforward, two-part directive. Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you.
The sequence of those commands in James is critical. Resistance without submission to God is futile. The adversary is a highly intelligent, powerful spiritual entity. Human intellect is insufficient to outsmart him. Believers overcome by first submitting to God's authority. This means adopting the posture of Christ. Then, the resistance involves utilizing the truth of Scripture, much like Jesus did during his own temptation in the wilderness.
In Ephesians 6, the Apostle Paul describes this as putting on the full armor of God. The very first piece of equipment mentioned is the belt of truth. Since the devil is described by Jesus as the father of lies, the primary defense is an uncompromising grip on reality as defined by God. It involves taking every thought captive and holding it up against the light of what Jesus has spoken.
The process of overcoming is a daily reliance on the Holy Spirit for discernment and strength. It is recognizing that while the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, the believer operates from a position of secured victory. The war has been won at the cross, even if the localized battles continue. The believer's role is to stand firm in the territory that Jesus has already reclaimed.
The trajectory of the adversary is a downward spiral from the heights of the heavenly mountain to his ultimate, decisive defeat at the cross. The biblical narrative exposes a being consumed by pride, who moves through the earth seeking out vulnerabilities. Yet this dark reality is entirely captured by the arrival of the Good Shepherd. The trials of Job, the deception in Eden, and the daily pressures we face are answered by the profound promise of abundant life and the definitive victory of Jesus. The call to believers is to stand firm in that victory, resisting the accuser, not with human strength, but through the blood of the Lamb and the truth of his word. If you found this exploration of the biblical narrative thought-provoking, share this episode with someone who might appreciate a deeper look into these ancient texts.